I was one of the Native American children, adopted at birth and removed from our country's Indian reservation system. I was raised in a small middle-class farming community, but was never told of my true American Indian heritage. It was still taboo back in those early days. The years passed, and in 1987 I lost both parents. While going through their personal belongings, my wife discovered my adoption papers and she began a search. 5 years later, I was reunited with my biological Lakota family living on the Lower Brule Sioux Indian Reservation of South Dakota. I am a son of two mothers and a product of two worlds that had collided, but I have an equal amount of love and pride for both. I'm Paul LaRoche, and the stories you are about to see are an attempt to share this true American story of a hidden heritage. It was 2 weeks before Thanksgiving of 1993. Though we didn't know it, something was about to happen that evening that would forever change the course of destiny for my family and I. It wasn't unusual for me to read a lot of motivational books back in the day. I had just finished a book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by author Stephen Covey. In the book, he made reference to something called a paradigm shift. A paradigm is the way you perceive something, your point of view, your frame of reference, and your belief. In the book, as an example, Covey had a picture of an old woman. Her head was covered in a scarf, and she was wearing a fur coat. Then he revealed that it's actually a young, beautiful woman with her head turned away. The eye sees one thing when it's actually another. The only difference is our point of view. A paradigm is the map that you have in your mind. And once you have an accurate map, then your behavior and your attitude make all the difference in the world. Before I resume the story, I must back up to the year 1987. It was one of the worst years in our family's life. But as time would pass, 5 years to be exact, it would become one of the best. That year, I lost both of my parents, my adoptive parents. Now, I never referred to them as adoptive parents, but following the events of 1993, I found the need to use this term to accurately tell the story. They died within a year of one another, and my wife, Kathy, while going through their personal belongings, discovered an envelope. It was hidden at the bottom of a dresser drawer, and it contained some information about the adoption that had taken place years earlier. She knew that letter was going to play a very important role in our lives. Without letting me know of the discovery, she began a search. Now, this was in the days before Ancestry.com and 23andMe, so she went to work, old school style. It just so happens that I have a first cousin who's a Catholic nun. She's 20 years older than me, so we never really knew each other all that well while we were growing up. When I came into the family in the year 1955, she was just leaving for college and nurses training. It so happened that in 1955, she was stationed at St. Mary's Hospital in Pierre, South Dakota, where I was born. So Kathy put 2 and 2 together and asked my cousin about the letter. She also had a hunch about the location of the hospital. You see, Pierre, South Dakota is located a short 60 miles away from several of the Indian reservations in central South Dakota. Kathy was always curious about my darker complexion. I always told her that I was of French-Canadian ancestry, but she had other thoughts on that. My cousin acknowledged that St. Mary's took in a lot of Native American babies, and was very active in the adopting out of Indian children. Then she suggested to Kathy that if she ever wanted more information about my adoption, to let her know, indicating that she knew something more about the adoption secrets. She also issued a warning to Kathy that my biological connection was from an area that was, quote, all Indian. Kathy and I met the summer of 1972. From my earliest recollection, Kathy was curious about my adoption and used to ask me if I ever wanted to know more about my biological background. My answer was always the same. I didn't want any information about another family other than my adoptive mom and dad. Out of love and respect for my parents, I felt that I never needed to look anywhere else. That's different with a lot of adoptees these days, as many adoptions are open right from the start. Back in those days, it was still taboo to openly proclaim that you had Native American descent or lineage in your family tree. Many families kept that information secret, and in most extreme cases, the information was lost and forever discarded. Sadly, for generations to come, the information was lost. So unbeknownst to me, Kathy began a search. With the help of my cousin, the nun, the search lasted 5 years. Somewhere during that time, my cousin was able to locate who she thought was my biological family, and she made an introductory phone call. Keep in mind that this was all done without the help of any kind of genetic testing or DNA. Because she was careful, the process was lengthy, and there were several phone conversations back and forth without my knowledge. She finally had enough information to feel that the possible biological connection was correct. So now fast forward to where the story started. It was 2 weeks before Thanksgiving of 1993, and that evening a phone call came into our small apartment. Kathy was the first to speak. I could hear the exchange, and so I kind of knew what was going on. Kathy would look at me every once in a while, but I gestured by waving my arms that I didn't want them to know that I was there. I was not ready to speak to somebody who I knew nothing about, and I remember feeling very uncomfortable. The conversation went on for some time, and finally Kathy said, "Here's Paul." And she handed me the phone. So that was it, the moment of truth. On the other end of the line was a gentleman who introduced himself as my biological brother. His first words to me were, "Hey, bro, you're a Lakota," and my jaw dropped. Well, there it was, in black and white, so to speak. The words spilled out for the first time in over 37 years. "You are Lakota." We went on to exchange our life stories, and in a matter of an hour or so, our lives, as we knew them, were forever changed. The paradigm shift had taken place. I grew up as Paul Summers, but the person I was would never be the same. I was now Paul Summers LaRoche, the son of two mothers. One of the mothers gave me life, and the other raised me to be all that I am today. I need to say that the paradigm shift and the change was all for the better, and as time would go by, it would be the best thing that ever happened to us. But for the time being, I was trying to absorb my newfound heritage, a heritage that had been hidden from birth. You see, neither of us had known the other had existed all those years. It turns out that my biological mother had kept my birth an absolute secret. She told no one, not even her closest friends. Things were different back in those days, and because of the isolated location, it was not uncommon for someone to go for months without contact from other family or friends. One piece of information shared that first phone conversation was this. My brother, we came to find out, was 1 year younger than me. I also had a sister who was several years older. She was living, and I had another sister who had died many years ago. She had been the oldest. All of the other siblings had remained on the reservation with the family. So the question came up, Why was I, out of all the children, the one given up for adoption? That would be a question that would remain unanswered until this day as my mother took that information to her grave. By the way, both my biological parents were deceased by the time the call came in. As you might imagine, my mind was racing and going through a process that is really hard to explain. It takes a long time to come to terms with suddenly finding out things about your genetic past that you never knew about. It was like, in the blink of an eye, I became part of a new family, a new community, a new tribe, and in fact, a new world. One that would transform our lives forever. But it's what my brother said at the end of the phone conversation that would forever change the course of destiny for my family and I. He just said, "Come on home." After the call, we immediately went to work calling other friends and family to share the exciting news. We were so excited that the enthusiasm spilled over without thinking that others might not feel as excited as we were about this newfound discovery. In the minutes and hours following that phone call, my mind went into overdrive trying to process that information. There was a definite overload. I remember one of my first reactions was to question if the information was really accurate. Was this really possible? Perhaps there was a mistake. I didn't want to completely let go and embrace the news 100%. But it was my wife's intuition that all this was in fact true, and I, in fact, was a Lakota. Well, a very important part of that first phone call was that we were invited to visit the new family and to have a homecoming. Specifically, the invitation was to visit and be reunited that coming Thanksgiving Day, which was 2 weeks away. Imagine trying to process all that. You're right. My mind was cluttered with different thoughts about this homecoming. Our next hurdle, and one that we didn't see coming, was to convince our families that we hadn't lost our minds. It was mostly the elders. Remember, my parents were both deceased when this call came in. Had they been living, no way would I have had the constitution to pursue trying to find a different family and to have a reunion. Our living relatives from our hometown were voicing some caution. After all, Kathy had done her research. But this visit was based on a single phone call. We knew very little about these new relatives, and we were talking about going to visit them on a remote Indian reservation in central South Dakota. The reservations of South Dakota have a reputation of being among some of the poorest counties in America. Actually, Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, in the southwest corner of the state, is in fact the poorest county in America. Our reservation, the Lower Brule Sioux Indian Reservation, located in central South Dakota, along the Missouri River between the cities of Chamberlain and the capital city of Pierre. And yes, Lower Brule was among the impoverished reservation towns of South Dakota, but not in the same category as Pine Ridge. The place that we had planned to meet was called the Squeaky Door Grocery Store. It was in the reservation town of Lower Brule. In our minds, we imagined a set of old wooden swing doors like the ones you would see in old Western saloons, and an old country grocery store. The whole homecoming trip seemed like the greatest adventure of a lifetime, and we hadn't even left yet. The 2 weeks before the reunion were a flurry of activities, including physical and mental preparation. This was before the internet, so I read everything I could get my hands on regarding the Lakota Sioux Indian Reservation and the Native American tribes of South Dakota. I still had this feeling of apprehension and doubt about the actual authenticity of the discovery, but Kathy assured me that she felt good about it. And so, against the advice of family and friends, 2 weeks later we packed up our Oldsmobile, which was in pretty bad shape, by the way, from a previous car accident, and we headed west, like the days of old. We drove from Minneapolis, where we were living at the time, to Worthington, Minnesota, our hometown, and then began a 4.5-hour trip from Minnesota to South Dakota, really from one world to another. Even the first leg of the trip, heading west along I-90, took on new meaning. I noticed for the first time the road sign from the turnoff to the small town of Pipestone, Minnesota. Pipestone. The next thing I noticed was the huge sign figure of Buffalo Bill Cody that towered over a truck stop exit right there in Sioux Falls. I took extra notice of the city's name itself, Sioux Falls. But my heart began to race as we passed Chamberlain. It was a magnificent sight as we crossed over the Missouri River, almost a mile wide at that point. But the most dramatic revelation was how the landscape had drastically changed, from the flat farm fields to gentle rolling hills that appeared as we drove west of the river. Then came the interstate road sign for the small town of Reliance, and the sign also read, Lower Brule Sioux Tribal Headquarters, directing us to turn and to head slightly to the north for about 7 miles. Then there was a sign for us to turn at this county road and to head west again. Several more miles, and there it was, the sign along the roadside that read, Now entering the Lower Brule Sioux Indian Reservation. We stopped the car at this point, got out to take in the sights and to snap a few pictures and to catch our breath. There was no turning back at this point. As we proceeded along the winding county blacktop, we were stunned by the beauty of the rolling hills, bluffs, and the grassland. It really looked like a scene out of the movie Dances with Wolves. Until finally we came over the crest of a hill, and there before us was the expanse of the Missouri River again. This time we could see from horizon to horizon. We didn't realize that the river passed right through the reservation. Now the road was winding downward, twisting and turning as we slowly and anxiously approached the tiny reservation town of Lower Brule. There it was, the small village, tucked down in between the bluffs and resting along the Missouri River. We drove down the final little short stretch of county blacktop. Our son and daughter, Shane and Nicole, made the first observation. Riding on horseback in the ditch that paralleled the road were 7 or 8 young Native American boys from town. One of our kids said, "Hey, Mom and Dad, look, real Indians." Kathy smiled a little bit and she said, "Yeah, could be one of your cousins." We pulled into town, made a couple of turns, and there was the squeaky door grocery store. We pulled up and parked and sat there for a few minutes, too nervous to get out. But we did finally, and the 4 of us opened the door. To say there was a moment of awkwardness is an understatement. Our eyes darted around the small grocery store, and it was plain to see that all eyes were on us. Neither of us knew what the other looked like, so there was a little bit of weirdness, but within a minute or so, somebody came up to us and said, "Hey, you guys the Summers family?" Finally, at last, there we stood face to face with each other, everyone smiling with joy and curiosity. We met my brother, his wife, and several of the other store employees that were there. The ice was finally broken. And it's hard to describe that feeling of meeting a sibling for the first time in 38 years. But it was a joyous moment for all of us, just like you see on the TV reunion shows today. We shook hands, hugged, cried, and spoke briefly, and then headed for my brother's ranch house several miles from the grocery store. The ranch house was on the outskirts of town, on a higher mesa parcel of land they called West Brule. It was a really beautiful drive. We drove up this steep inclined hill, and then it leveled off. From there you could see for miles and miles in all directions. and you could see the Missouri River now as it went from horizon to horizon. The ranch was a nice and well-kept homestead with livestock scattered around and farm machinery here and there. The inside was clean and well-decorated with collectibles and obvious American Indian trimmings. So there it was, and there we were, home after all these years. All our fears disappeared instantly, and we spent the remainder of the day and the weekend catching up on the missing years of our lives. We met a lot of family members and shared a lot of stories. We feasted and laughed and could barely sleep that first evening. Once inside the ranch house, for a while one almost forgot that we were on an Indian reservation. Everything was pretty much the same as it was in the outside world. The kids became friends instantly, and we were welcomed back into the family with open arms. It was the beginning of a new life, one that we couldn't have possibly imagined. Regarding my interest in music, the family was quick to let me know how lucky I had been. My brother had grown up under poor conditions, and trying to nurture a love for music would have been almost impossible. My brother commented that I most likely would have grown up and been a rancher just like him. There would have been little money for musical instruments, he pointed out. I told him that I never learned to read music and just played by ear. It was then I noticed a striking picture on the wall of an elderly Indian woman playing an old upright piano. The piano was sitting outside in kind of tall prairie grass. When I asked my brother who that was, he said, "Well, that's your great-grandmother. And she also played the piano, and come to think of it, she played by ear." It was my new family that encouraged us to go back into music. You see, I had almost given up on music at that point, and I thought my music career was over. But not so fast. It was our new family now that said, you really have got to go back into music. This time you have a purpose and you have a story to tell. I could tell what Kathy was thinking. Oh boy, here we go again. But this time it would be different. So with a new family, a new cultural identity, and a new lease on life, we packed up our things and headed back to Minneapolis. None of us could stop talking about the homecoming that had just taken place, when we couldn't wait to share the story with our family from Minnesota. With a moment to absorb the whole situation, we could see that the hand of God was at work, weaving our lives and these two worlds together. Even then, we couldn't have imagined how life was about to change. Where this newfound purpose was going to take us, we had no idea, and how music was about to come back into our lives. It was the best Thanksgiving of our lives. Thank you for joining us on this Thanksgiving homecoming story. I'm Paul LaRoche, and this is Hidden Heritage.